Hello and welcome to Maya with Haste. In this video we're going to take our first look at UV coordinates. Now we've kind of teased this in the last few videos where I've brought up the UV editor as well as looked at procedural content. But now we're going to take a look at what UVs really are and how we can manipulate them. Bring in a new cube by going to Polygons and clicking the Cube button. And let's go under Windows, UV Editor. Now here we can see in the UV editor we have this gray space, or light gray, compared to the rest of the area which is all gray. This light gray space is where we're going to put all of our UV coordinates, most of the time. There are exceptions where we can work outside of this space, but for the most part this is where we're going to be working. Now the values go from 0 to 1. Now this is our U direction. Think of it kind of like the x-axis, but we call it U to differentiate it from x, y, and z coordinates that we have in normal 3D space. And of course we have our V direction, which goes vertically up the side. Now U and V absolutely stand for nothing. It's just another set of coordinate systems, another basis set of coordinates for us to work with. Technically, this could be called the Uvw coordinate system. If this was three-dimensional, coming out of the screen would be our W direction. And that actually is a real thing. You can have three-dimensional textures. It's just not so easy to manipulate them, and typically it's created from procedural content or from stacking multiple textures together, kind of like what I've done already with medical images in some other videos here. So while we're in this editor, if we right click, you'll notice we have our familiar things like edges and vertices and faces, but we have a couple other options, shells and UVs. So when we marquee select over this object, we'll notice under UV mode that it appears that we're selecting the vertices, or at least some kind of representation of the vertices that's been flattened out. No, these are UVs. Now for each vertex, we usually have a mapping of it to a UV value, and that's what we're manipulating here in this two-dimensional coordinate system. We can use our W, E, and R keys just like before, except now we're moving in two-dimensional space. So if I use the W key for the move command, I can of course grab an axis and begin manipulating this object. At the moment, we have this simple gray material on the object with no real texture, so we're not going to get any feedback. We're not going to get an intuition on what we're actually doing when we're manipulating the UV coordinates unless we add something to it. So let's create a material. Let's go to Window, Materials, Hypershade. Now with our Hypershade open, this is the material I made in the last video. I would recommend going back and making it yourself, but if you don't want to follow along, let's just create one very quickly by middle mouse clicking on Fong, dragging it into the viewport, giving it a name. We're going to call this checkerboard _M. I'm going to give this a color, but I want the color to actually be a checkerboard itself. So I'm going to middle mouse click and drag a checkerboard node in here, and then connect the out color of this to the in color of my material. You'll see immediately the viewport updates, and now we have this nice checkerboard. Let's click on our object, right click on it, go to Assign Existing Material, and choose the checkerboard. And there we are. Now we have something to work with. Now we're going to have some visual feedback when we begin manipulating things. Now, this view is kind of not working for me. I'm covering things up, so let's see a new way of looking at this information. Over here on the left side of our panel are different viewport options, different windowing options to set things up more interestingly. So I'm going to click on this split view, split vertical button, and what you'll notice is I get a window over here as well as a window panel over here. These panels can be anything I want them to be. I can click on panels and get a whole list of different panels I can make this panel be. If I go under panel, you can see I have my UV editor right there, and now I have not only a view of my 3D scene, but I also get to see my 2D UVs at the same time. I'm going to right click, go to UV mode, select them all really quick, zoom in a little bit because they're kind of hard to see, especially on this checkerboard background. But if I grab one of these UVs and start manipulating it, you'll notice what's happening. I'm changing what information this object is sampling. That is, each of these UVs basically dictates a point to start sampling information, and the computer system is going to interpolate what information to sample along the edges of our object. So as I begin manipulating this information, notice how screwy it gets. Now it particularly looks bad with a very nice ordered pattern like this one here. But if I look from this side view, you can actually see what's happening. So I'm actually manipulating this edge right here. The system is doing its best to figure out how this information is connected and how to properly project this texture information onto that surface. Now every object in Maya that's a primitive type is going to come in with a default set of UVs that are typically the best, or at least very handy and useful. So in the case of a sphere, here's our sphere object. Each one of these faces, even though they have different sizes, actually have the same size in our UV coordinate space. And this is where we can get into trouble with things. We can distort our UVs, as you saw with the cube before, and make things appear very different than how the spatial ratios of our object are in the three-dimensional world. So let's right-click on this object, and let's assign our existing material of the checkerboard. And here you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. So with the sphere, we can come into our UV coordinate system over here, and we can begin manipulating it. What if we decide to use scale? So as you can see here, as I scale the UV smaller and smaller and smaller, what happens is the features on this object get larger and larger. If I make this even smaller, my entire sphere is only sampling a single checkerboard portion of this entire image. We're only getting 2 black squares and 2 white squares. Of course, you can go outside of that 0 to 1 range, although it depends on how you want to do it, really, and what you're trying to do. What happens typically is that it's repeated. Now, if you bring this object into Unity or other similar programs, you usually get to choose how UV coordinates outside the 0 to 1 range are used. You can tell it to just clamp the value, use a border value, or continue to repeat, or even mirror the texture object. But this is a great way if you actually want to continue to repeat the information over and over and over again. So that's a sphere. Let's take a look at something else really quick. Here's a cylinder. Now, a cylinder is really interesting. It's got this round portion in the center, but then it's got these 2 flat tops. But then the center is a little bit more like the sphere, meaning the sides have been unrolled. A cut has been made along one edge. And of course, if we right-click on this object, hit F8 to be in object mode, of course, right-click and go to Assign Existing Material and use that checkerboard, you're going to notice that seam is going to cause problems. So here we go. We're rotating all the way around. But that seam on the very end is going to create a discontinuity between these elements. So here, if we move this seam to the side, you'll notice we're changing what part it's sampling. And if this seam is not sampling the same information as this other seam, you're going to get a break. Typically, we try very hard to prevent seams from being seen. Now, with these primitive objects, seams don't seem that important. But when you're dealing with humanoid characters or buildings or other objects with more complicated geometry, that seam can immediately make it look like your object's fake, breaks the illusion. So we try to prevent that at all costs. So in our next video, we're going to take a few minutes and learn how we can manipulate these UVs in one of the simplest ways. And that is actually by using the UV menu and choosing different kinds of projections. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Feel free to leave comments below telling me kinds of material you'd like me to cover in the future. Thanks again. Bye.